Good evening and welcome to this evening's discussion entitled Convergence, a new paradigm for thinking about our cities. Today's event is brought to you by Melbourne Conversations, the City of Melbourne's program of free public talks. As I said earlier, my name is Anthony Fennell and I'm pleased to be hosting tonight's panel discussion. For those of you who don't know me, I'm the presenter of Future Tense on ABC Radio National, and I'm also the author of the book The Future and Related Nonsense, published by HarperCollins, which came out last year and you can still get it. Now, this discussion will explore how the practice and paradigm of convergence is informing, shaping and changing the nature and future of post-industrial knowledge cities and how we work, live, make and share. And I guess the big question is, what is convergence? Well, for me at least, convergence is about heightened collaboration and engagement brought about by new technologies, particularly digital technologies. But it isn't simply about practice, one could argue, it's about mindset. As the US media theorist Harry Jenkins once said, convergence is a culture rather than a technological process. Now, let me introduce our guests. Professor George Cairns is the head of the School of Management at RMIT University. He's also an architect, philosopher and sustainability champion. Bronwyn Clune is a journalist, writer and regular columnist for The Guardian. Bronwyn's also a member of the Public Interest Journalism Foundation, which explores new ways of funding journalism through crowdfunding. Professor Nikos Papastiadis is the director of the Research Unit in Public Cultures in the School of Culture and Communication at the University of Melbourne. Flora Salim is the Research Fellow at the School of Computer Science and Information Technology at RMIT University. And finally, Claire Scott is a clinician scientist who specialises in the treatment of breast and ovarian cancer at the Royal Melbourne and Royal Women's Hospitals. And she also leads an ovarian cancer laboratory at the Walter and Eliza Hall Institute of Medical Research. So, after all of that, please give them a round of applause. Nikos, starting off with you, my rough definition there of convergence: heightened collaboration and engagement brought about by new technologies. Build on that for us. What does convergence mean to you?
Well, if we take the idea of the industrial city and compare that to the post-industrial city, there's an automatic point of distinction. The industrial city was one where specialisation was the key to progress. Today we might say that the key to development is no longer just specialisation in and of itself, because we've become painfully aware of all the pitfalls and limitations and dead ends and disasters that come with specialisation, and that in fact what we're trying to see is a mode of thinking that is more collaborative and more horizontal, more open to dialogue and conversation and consultation and participation. So in a sense, convergence speaks to both the pitfalls of a previous mindset and the limitations of the way in which we organise cities in the industrial epoch. And so we're moving towards a different mode of thinking about the connectedness, both of media forms, cultural mindsets, but also cultural worldviews, and the combination of different techniques and platforms for the communication and dissemination of information.
And this is happening across a wide range of industries and sectors, isn't it?
That's right. The whole point of convergence is it's not specialised purely in the media context, as it's often associated with in terms of how news is, or information or advertising is disseminated, or how audiences are connected through fan base and branding and so forth. But it's also connected to a whole way in which commodities are produced, the way in which knowledge is disseminated, and in which research is conducted. I, for instance, am the director of the research unit, which you mentioned, which isn't just people from my faculty, let alone my school. In fact, it's drawn from 4 different faculties, from architecture, from engineering, from the social sciences and the humanities, because we've all come to the very simple realisation that today problems are either so vast or so complex that no one can grasp the minutiae and link them to the whole, or see the whole and connect it back to the detail.
All right. Look, Nick, thank you very much. That's a terrific start for this conversation. Flora, convergence as a paradigm for innovation, it isn't just about collaboration and sharing, is it? It's about using new technologies to make targeted and relevant contributions.
Definitely. And we live in the era of pervasive computing, and I just want to wave my smartphone here, and I believe almost every one of you have one in your pocket. And this actually opens possibilities of new ways of interacting with information, and not just interacting and sharing, but also you are becoming the curator of your own information, what to share, and how do you engage with people out there. So we live in such an immersion of digital world, so one of my research areas is also mixed reality. So you can actually interact with things as with even digital matters as tangible and as physical as they are, as you're interacting with this glass, for example, and when you drink it. And people have become so accustomed to digital matters. And I think this also influences even decision making in cities, in government.
But crucially, we're not just talking about inclusiveness for its own sake, are we?
Exactly. Yeah. So how are we actually going to curate that participation? So I'm interested in also, there's so much information that you can take on, and there's so much information that you can encourage people to share. But how do you actually structure, and how do you even design that participation? I think that's really important to make convergence becoming really useful.
Claire Scott, the idea I mentioned there earlier, Henry Jenkins' idea that convergence is culture rather than a technological process. Is it either or is it really both?
I think that we use a cultural way of thinking and really hijack the technology around us to gain whatever end we have in sight. So particularly as scientists, for example, science these days is big. You can't do small science very well anymore. The technology we require is expensive. The results that we stand to produce, for example, with genomics, have huge impact for our society and our community. So really it is a way of thinking that we need to get the very best people on the job. I really liked what Nick said about it's either vast or incredibly specialised. So the people I deal with every day in my life are on the other side of the world in about 3 different continents, and that doesn't hold any barriers to our participation. But this whole idea of what's driving us is a really important thing as well, I think.
So this term convergence, for many people it's going to be a new term, but it's really quite an old idea, isn't it?
I think you have to collaborate in order to reach the ends that you have that are bigger than you can achieve yourself. So it's all about making more out of the whole than the sum of the parts. And in science, certainly, we all have specific expertise, and then we need to harness expertise of a collaborator who we may never have met, but we may have read their work, and instantly, with the help of the iPhone and email, we can become collaborators. So I think that whole concept of bringing together synergies and aligning other people's views and direction with yours really allows you to achieve a lot more.
Bronwyn Clune, your background is in the media, and in that sphere there's been convergence in 2 ways, hasn't there? I mean, there's been the convergence that we've seen between different forms of media, and that's probably well covered. Most people understand that or know that. But there's also been convergence between the producers of media and the consumers of it. Talk to us about that.
Well, to me, as a journalist, it's probably one of the most exciting areas that we've seen sort of convergence happen. As you mentioned, and as Nikos mentioned, there's a traditional convergence of silo media like print, broadcast, merging with telecommunications and with IT. But what we've also seen is the convergence of audiences and journalists. And this is something that sort of, it wasn't something that was set up to happen. It's something that I think sits nicely with that quote from Jenkins, in that it's something that's sort of come from the audience, and it's something that's happened quite naturally without any real direction from anyone. Something like Twitter, for example, was invented as a way to keep in touch with your friends, and really has evolved to be a media powerhouse in how people can share information around what is happening with them. And I still think, in breaking news situations, there's no better news forum than Twitter, which really is a chaotic environment for media to happen. Now,
you say it happened quite naturally, but we're still coming to terms with it, aren't we? We're really just at the beginning of what this means, what this reinvention of the producer and the audience, what that means.
Yeah, no, it's certainly something I don't think anyone has any answers to what, where we're going to land up. And one of the things that it has done is really confront media business models, which is something which, ultimately we're still yet to solve and, is an immediate problem. And it's not to say that people practising citizen journalism, for want of a better word, are necessarily going to replace journalists. There will be, a model in there somewhere, but we still need to fund the ways that we create media at the level that we expect media to be created.
George Cairns, you're our last speaker. Let's bring you into the conversation. A lot of the buzz around convergence as a driver of innovation is based on the idea that a lot of the problems our cities will face in the future will be complex and multifaceted. And we're already starting to see that with things like climate change and a mass urbanisation. So therefore we require a multidisciplinary solutions. It's a pretty persuasive argument, isn't it?
Yes, it is a very persuasive argument, but I'm ambivalent about it because I can see huge advantages with the type of promise which is put forward in Convergence. And I went back and looked at Harry Jenkins's techno-futurist dream. I have to say that my scepticism is based somewhat in life experience. I remember, as a child in the 60s back in the UK, the promise of a future where we would all live with robots, we would live lives of leisure, everything would be done for us. That reality for many people is called unemployment. Similarly, in Glasgow in the 1990s, I saw the emergence of this new city which was going to be the call centre capital of Europe. I think it peaked at something like about 7,500 to 9,000 part-time jobs. This was after 260,000 engineering jobs had gone. So I start off with that side of scepticism. The other issues I have, I think, are at the one extreme, the convergence of media can be a dangerous thing where you see powerful interests like the Murdoch empire, sort of controlling media to a large extent and then imposing particular political doctrines and ideologies onto editorial facets.
But we have had that for quite some time, haven't we, really?
Yes, but there's no reason why we should support a sort of strengthening of that through convergence. And I think at the other extreme is the notion that by opening up communication to everybody, you give equal weight to sound scientific judgment and ranting from idiots who have a vested interest in something, or climate skeptics who don't actually accept that something's happening to this planet.
So it's a good thing, but we need to maintain healthy scepticism.
It has, yes, it has huge potential for doing good, but I think the dream that's being sold is somewhat naive on some parts.
Claire Scott, the potential that's there. We've heard about inclusion. What about, and you touched on this, I think, the funding. It's always been difficult to do the sort of research that you do. It's difficult to try to get funding to do that research as well. How does a move toward a more convergent society benefit scientists like yourself in attracting funds?
Well, certainly I think motivation is a very big part of how we all behave. And so in terms of a carrot and stick approach, getting funding is a huge carrot and we don't survive without it. So in fact, the funding structures themselves have changed quite a bit over the last 10 years, and they're able to devise constraints around how we apply. So for example, if people really feel that big science is the answer, then they can require you to have a certain number of collaborators either within Australia or perhaps in different continents, and also to support different disciplines. So maybe ensuring that you have bioinformaticians involved or epidemiologists, so different types of cross-disciplinary approaches within your grant proposal. And certainly what we're always trying to do to get those mega research dollars is to act at the very top of the field of whatever we're in. And if that means collaborating with, half a team who are overseas, but still constructing a viable cohort of scientists in Australia, then we do that at the drop of a hat. So there is nothing that we wouldn't consider in terms of ensuring that we have a sound team, and it is a team approach.
Flora, you're nodding your head there. Your thoughts on that? You agree?
Yeah, because you are in medical research, and the national grants that I'm applying mainly are Australian Research Council. There have been major changes in ARC, but somehow the current way ARC grants are actually assessed are the grants are sent to different panels. So it's really somehow we feel that we are discouraged from doing transdisciplinary collaboration, and if you're actually sending your grant proposal to multiple panels, it's gonna be a bit hard to actually get it up. So it's no matter how many disciplines you actually have in a grant proposal, sometimes you really just have to send it to one. So I think the way Australian Research Council need to look at this, especially with this convergence, it has to change. And I think we as academics actually need to actually show that applied research that are exciting and that can actually do good for the future cities are those that are transdisciplinary. And there has to be models for that. And I think they just need to know that there should be a funding model that support that as well.
Bronwyn Clune, crowdfunding is one of your professional interests. Mm-hmm. It's not easy, is it? I mean, there's enormous potential there. We hear it talked about a lot. I mean, it is convergence in practice, but it is difficult. How effective is it?
Yeah, look, it's certainly not a go-to thing for everything, and I think it's probably being promoted a little bit much as a solution to getting funding. And we had the recent example of everyone putting in money to revive the Climate Council, what is now called the Climate Council. But it was interesting that politicians noted, oh well, I guess it didn't need our funding anyway. So there is that risk that things that have always been traditionally funded by governments are now seen as the public's role to fund. And I don't think that's necessarily a good thing. One interesting example of where a kind of funding has brought forward some science thinking is actually a Melbourne startup called Kaggle. You guys heard of Kaggle? Yeah, so what they did is they put up really complex science questions to an open audience, and they put up prizes like in the order of $1 million for people to solve, and they invited anyone in the world to try and solve these really complex problems, and people with no actual background in them landed up solving the questions and winning a prize of $1 million. So I think there's some element of crowdfunding and crowdsourcing that is very powerful in this area, but as to how far it can go in funding things is yet to be answered, and I'm slightly sceptical as to it being the only answer to things.
And Nikos, your thoughts on that? I mean, are you concerned that crowdfunding just leads to governments or organisations deciding that they can be more hands-off, that they can leave it to the people?
Well, there's a number of issues that come out of this ideology of participation. One is the surreptitious shift of public assets into private interests, which I think is something that needs to be more carefully scrutinised. Secondly, the idea that participation, while being promoted in the rhetoric of democratic experience, also produces new questions of evaluation. No. It's okay for us to all participate in a conversation, but who's listening, who's interpreting, who's deliberating, and therefore who's then in a position to act. And so participation has, in crowdsourcing of information, in fact, requires a process that Flora mentioned, process of curating, filtering, editing, selecting the signal from all the background noise. And so that will always be a very complex interpretive process. And to be able to do that today is an enormously challenging task, because it, as we've used the other buzzword today, collaboration, that requires at least competency in 4 or 5 different fields. Competency in dealing with different languages, different genres, different worldviews, different bureaucracies, because all these expand. And let's face it, different psychologies, because if you're working in big teams, there's lots of different kinds of egos as well.
Just before we move on to another point, George, your thoughts?
Yes, I've now come back to this sort of healthy scepticism. I agree about the fact that we're facing very difficult problems now, which require transdisciplinary, cross-disciplinary teams. I had an experience last week of working on a cross-disciplinary team-based project, and funnily enough, we did it very well using butcher's paper, pens, blue tack, and stuff like that. And also, as my background in architecture, designing and constructing buildings is a very complex, problem, and the construction industry is renowned for being one of the most, sort of competitive and full of infighting. And yet, I always found that if you were willing and able and had the mindset to collaborate with people, you could produce very effective buildings, and that was in the days before computer-aided design and smartphones or anything. So I just go back to the idea that the promise is there, but I don't know that the human capability, mindset and willingness is there.
And we shouldn't get too caught up on the technology necessarily.
Certainly not. I agree with the notion that we need to find ways of mediating and curating, and that's becoming ever more complex in terms of the amount of information, the ease with which it's put on to websites or anything, and then we get lost in overdose.
Claire Scott, the sort of environment that fosters convergence or could foster effective convergence, what type of city or community is likely to do best, do you think? Perhaps we should start with the city of Melbourne as we're in that fine city at the moment.
Well, I think it is a good place to start from that perspective. And again, with my bias being medical research, we're very fortunate to have what's known as the Parkville Strip, which is a whole host of institutions who collaborate in various areas of medical research. So it does mean fundamentally we are a city rich in knowledge in science and in medical research. So there's no doubt being here means it's easy to go and meet with like-minded people and see your colleagues, and you don't have to go too far on a tram to get to them. And as long as it's not too rainy and windy, then you're inclined to get out of doors to do that. Good coffee helps, and we have that as well. So we have a number of attributes that would engender, discussion. We don't have free Wi-Fi, and I think that not everyone is fortunate enough to work in institutions where easy access to Wi-Fi is the rule. So I think spaces, access to knowledge via the internet, and really places that are conducive to conversations, because the internet will only ever go so far and conversations are extremely important. Another thing I wanted to raise was this concept of the team approach involving consumers or potentially people coming from a sideways angle into your conversation. We haven't directly addressed that tonight, but as part of research that's really important. So we had a meeting at WeHi today on a rather lateral topic, and we had 5 out of 15 people in the room were consumers. So that means that they were either patients or relatives of patients who had done a lot of hard thinking and acting to try to improve the role of research or medical care delivery for their family member, even if they were now deceased. And so these consumers have an incredible voice. They bring skills to the table which they may have spent decades honing in parallel areas. And so in terms of curating, it is really our job to be able to set up websites with links that lead them in the right direction. And then we know which the other good websites are, so that we're able to, I think, provide a knowledge trail. But of course that means you might be cornering the market, and if you're focusing in on one particular area, then there's always that knowledge, that risk of bad curation.
Flora, picking up on that, I know it's one of your points is that we need better interfaces, or we need to think about the sort of interfaces we have if we're looking at convergence and trying to make it work, trying to be inclusive.
Exactly. So how do we actually foster convergence by fostering collaboration? And in order to foster collaboration, you actually need people to interact, and better interfaces are required. And therefore, we actually, because we are so inundated with data, there's so much things going on. Like, you wake up in the morning, somebody give you text messages, or you might have Facebook messages to go through, popping up, so many things happening, but there's also ways to curate it, but now, and if you want to foster this kind of collaboration within cities for better cities, and you want to have some sort of open discussion about specific problems, and cities are wicked problems, we certainly need to actually engage people in a complex problem in a simple way. That's why better interface is required. I'm going to show you a bit later a video of one of my projects that actually looked into collaboration across different functions in a team and using some sort of interface. But also in terms of collaboration, I think one point I'd like to bring out as well is there's so much knowledge that is pocketed in different disciplines. And I'd like to actually raise back Nico's point on, like, now certainly with this convergence, we actually need an expert that actually know how to communicate across disciplines, but there are not many. And the reason why is because we haven't seen the evolution of the way education and training in this convergence or pervasive computing world, I would say, because our kids are actually taught to specialize since they're primary, secondary. They have to specialize in something. And okay, if you're specializing in math, that's what you have to focus on. They're not being taught to actually communicate cross-discipline, and they suddenly have to learn that maybe after they finish uni. So it's certainly not helpful at all. And a lot of the technologies that have been made are very opportunistic, like, there's this opportunity, let's do it, but they don't see the need. So that's why these pockets of knowledge have to be communicated, and that's why I think training must do, this kind of training of convergence need to start even from primary age.
Nikos, so you wanted to follow up on that?
Yes, I think this is a crucial point, which is that our education is not necessarily leading towards convergence at all. And we still suffer from what the sociologists since the 60s have been calling trained blindness. That is specialisation to see only the particular things. Let's take a very simple example from health, let's say. A patient has symptoms. A surgeon sees something to cut out. An X-ray specialist sees a spot on which is a colour that's disfiguring, that therefore shows a problem. The oncologist sees a cocktail of drugs that needs to be calibrated. Who is the one that's coordinating all that data in order to convey the question of well-being? Same with architecture. We have issues that the architect says, yes, my job is to create an environment for comfort and well-being and inspiration. But on what information, on what aspirations, on what desires is that design coming from? So there is this complex configuration between information and the design process, between collaboration and the capacity to incorporate different voices at different stages. Traditionally, I'll just finish on this point, we've been trained to say the scientist works on a problem, the humanities explains the problem to the public or the solution to the public, or we call that the marketing department, and then the rest of us are consumers of it, where it will be the media, etc. But the interesting challenge now is for us not to be on a panel together, but to be in a studio or in a laboratory, in a workshop together, whereby we're collectively defining what the problem is in the first place, and so that Bronwyn doesn't come at the end to explain it to the public. She's part of the public consultation process in defining how we can see what a problem is. A humanities scholar doesn't just come in at the end, but comes in the midst of the development of the research agenda.
Bronwyn, I'll come to you in just a second, but George, give us some history on this, because in one sense, if you look back 100, 150 years ago, convergence, even if it wasn't called that, was much more popular in the sciences particularly. I mean, people were multidisciplinary in their approach to a lot of science. When did we start becoming obsessed with specialisation, and why did we go that way?
Well, I think it has varied across different disciplines. Certainly, in the field of my background, up until probably the mid-19th century, the master builder was the person who produced a building, probably in consultation with the end user in terms of eliciting user needs, producing the design, doing the engineering, etc. But then things became too complex and too specialised, and without the types of technologies to be able to deal with it in the way we now can. And this is where I think that modern technologies do enable this to happen. I don't think, we can't all be masters of all trades, but you picked up on the point about the architect. I think that the key role of, say, of an architect is to start with an end user and elicit discussion about what is the actual issue we're looking at here. We've been involved in some discussion over the last couple of weeks about the notion of strategic design as opposed to functional design. And I read a nice quote somewhere, and I can't attribute it. It said that a lot of designers spend far too much time designing the optimal solution to the wrong problem. And we need to reframe our problems. And I think that's where the types of technologies and communication techniques we have now can enable us to hold the discussion to reframe problems. But just one quick point, I think one of the problems to me is that our universities are still structured in disciplines. Flora raised about the Australian Research Council. We work in departments, colleges which are specialised. We don't do learning at university about how to deal with issues in society.
So there is, we'll come to you, Bronwyn, but so there is a lot of talk, isn't there, in the tertiary world, in the academic world, about being multidisciplinary in your approach, but it's not actually happening in the way in which the university structure itself is shaped.
It's been spoken about for as long as I can remember.
Bronwyn, your thoughts?
No, I was just thinking to the point of there being, there having to be that dual role. I think a really good example of something that's emerged in newsrooms in the last couple of years even is the role of a data journalist, who's someone who sort of works across tech and media and is really meant to be that intermediary between data and reinterpreting it for stories. Now that's a role that really didn't even exist 3-4 years ago, and these days it's still news when a newsroom hires a data journalist. But it's also interesting in that, newsrooms still tend to see that as, where does a data journalist sit? And at the moment, it's mostly in IT departments, but really that role needs to come into the newsroom, and there needs to be a real convergence there on creating these big data stories. It's still something that media loves to, think is amazing, but really hasn't pushed it forward. But that role of a data journalist, I think, is a good example of a new role that kind of is a result of convergence.
An interesting point that comes out of that is the idea that, you say to people, let's break down the silos. Most people will nod their head and say, yes, that's a good thing. But we're not starting with a blank piece of paper, are we? There are going to be people out there, there are vested interests that want to preserve what has been going on, regardless of what industry they're in. They're going to be against this kind of move, aren't they?
Yeah, no, the media is a funny one. I mean, we often hear how... we're often told that, we have to regulate the media, we have to hold on to media as it is, but it's in their interest to say that. I think, I'm pretty positive about the changes things like Convergence have brought for both audiences and for journalists. I think it's ultimately a very positive thing. And I really can't see any sort of those challenges that are thrown up as there being much of a negative push to it.
Claire Scott, your research area with oncology, I mean, you are Convergence in practice, aren't you? You and your team. Do you come up against people who don't want to cooperate?
There is one way of looking at it which is somewhat generational, and I think the reason that scientists who are at the cutting edge today are motivated to collaborate is because it is easier to do big science that way. So I think it all comes down to you will change your spots as a leopard if the camouflage helps you. I mean, you really need to be part of the movement. So if you look at the movement in each of these major disciplinary areas that we're talking about in science, it's clearly around big technology. And it's also around overcoming what we call, for example, in oncology, tumour streams. So we don't necessarily care if someone has lung cancer or bowel cancer or another type of rare cancer if we can identify that those three cancers are all driven by the same genetic pathway. So all of a sudden we try to break down those tumour stream barriers and address that as a problem that we have identified a molecular or technological solution for. Now, at the moment, that work is relatively new, and we are bringing in consumers and ethicists and all sorts of other disciplines and legal governance around the issue of identified data and so forth. There are massive issues, and again, that is forcing us to converge with all those disciplines that I just mentioned, because otherwise we are not going to be able to take this forward effectively. So again, I'm really in favour of carrots rather than sticks, and that you really evolve to address the problems as the world changes before your very eyes. That's my experience.
And George Cairns, the need to ensure that a convergent approach doesn't lead to groupthink. I know from a discussion that we've had previously that you would say, yes, we need convergent thinking, but we also need divergent thinking when we're looking at a problem.
Yes, I agree entirely. I think that, well, the danger of groupthink is where particular voices dominate the conversation and that other voices are excluded from it. So it has to be, done in this inclusive way. Despite what may appear my blank scepticism about this, I have seen examples of where this convergence, particularly the opportunities with new technologies, have worked really well. And the example I can think of is in the aftermath of the collapse of Rana Plaza in Bangladesh, where social response, consumer response using social media to communicate put huge pressure on the big retail chains, starting particularly in Europe. And I know that I've been involved with colleagues in quite a number of events here which have been tweeted, Facebooked across the world. So there is the opportunity to use this to deal with these types of issues and events.
So having a motivator, really, that's what we're talking about, isn't it? And Claire, I know this is a big thing for you, that when we look at your area of research, there is probably no greater motivation to become involved in cancer research if you're a patient than the fact that you actually have cancer yourself.
And even more so carers of patients, and particularly carers of patients with rare diseases or of children. So there you have individuals who have an incredibly strong drive, and if they're faced with a question or with a situation where they're not being offered alternatives by their treatment team, then they really take it upon themselves to develop knowledge that they would never have thought that they would do. It's completely outside their area. And I have numerous examples where that parent or that carer really was the person in Australia who knew the most about that condition, more than any of the specialists who are treating that patient. And so that is the power of knowledge, and it is at the behest of anyone to take that approach. And so again, I come back again and again, it sounds like scientists are all desperate, but this concept of a driver, a carrot, to be able to help your nearest and dearest because no one else can, it shows what's possible.
I'm going to get myself in trouble with the medical profession here by saying this, but there would be some people in the medical profession who would not be happy with that whole idea of a patient being the expert, if you like, on their own condition. They wouldn't like that at all.
Well, I think times have changed, and the reality is that patients have access to information, and many of us really understand that because of subspecialisation, that is the way forward. So again, I think times are changing. You can call it a generational change if you want to be kind, but really it's just getting with a moving program.
Bronwyn Clune, incentives. How does that play out in the media world? I mean, what incentives are there for people to truly collaborate, to become, for the audience to become part of the production side of it, if you like, in a meaningful way?
Well, I think sometimes it's motivated by frustration. They feel they have something to say and want to now have a platform on which to say it. But I don't think every time we participate that way it's premeditated. Sometimes it's just a matter of being in the right place at the right time and having the opportunity to take part in media creation. Someone's an accidental journalist. If they, walking somewhere, something happens, they take a photo and put that up on social media. To me, there's two ways that it can happen. Either it's premeditated and organised, and you now have the ability to have your say in some way. And the other time it's just, purely accidental. You're in the right place at the right time and that happens.
And that participation is going to come at different levels, isn't it? It's not going to be the same for everyone, of course.
No, it's not. And we have to recognise that although, things like social media have given a lot of people a voice, it hasn't given everyone a voice. And there's still sections of society that we need to seek out and listen to and talk to. So it's not a case of covering everyone. But it's interesting. I think one of the really interesting examples of communities self-organising and creating voices for themselves as a community is rotated curation accounts, or curated rotation, where it's a Twitter account that's shared amongst a community. So there's one for Melbourne that was organised by a friend of mine, actually Sarah Stokely, who set up a Twitter account called We Melbourne, and that every week that is tweeted from by someone different in Melbourne and tweeting about their experiences of the city. So those are things that weren't, organised by anyone but an individual, and a community came around it. So, I think the motivations are often honest and good.
Flora, those different levels of engagement, really. For somebody like you, how important is it to take that into account?
Yeah, we've learned for a long time now that in order for us to introduce new technology, we really have to give that sort of motivation, or we have to incentivize people in the uptake of technology, which is a bit, for example, just one example, one of the research I'm doing, because my area is also in context-aware sensing, so sensing data coming from you. And one area is, for example, in driving behavior monitoring. So we can actually start monitoring the way you drive if you, if we can actually learn data from the sensors collected on the sensors on your phone, for example. And we can then start looking at people if they are actually safe drivers or risky drivers. And people don't, if you introduce this kind of technology, they actually think this is a big brother technology watching over me, and I don't want to sign up. But in a few cities around the world, this kind of technology have been deployed because the insurance company, for example, take use of it. And if you're actually a safer driver, they will incentivize you by giving you much lower premium. It can be about at least 50% off if you're a safer driver, because they like to invest in safer drivers. So people actually then becoming, they will actually like to sign up on these kind of things. And actually for me, I'm also interested not to actually give people better visualization, that better drivers, that this is not just about you, this is not just about me, but it's actually giving safer roads. The road authorities are really interested in this kind of data, because if they can actually understand, like for example 80% people who actually drive around this curved road, they will actually come to a near crash, for example. There must be something wrong with the road design. It's not about the mistake might not be in the person. It might be the design of the road. So road authorities are very interested, and we're working with Vic Roads, TAC, in this kind of project, and actually to give public the feedback. Hey, you're actually doing this for greater good, not just for yourself. And I just wanted to pull one really good example from Japanese tsunami that happened 2 years ago. This is one great, really good example about public participation. There's this Fukushima radiation, and people just cannot wait for the media to actually tell them the level of radiation, nuclear radiation around Fukushima, if it's actually safe for them to actually leave the house or travel. There are a few people who actually come up with this, with hacking this Geiger counter, using Arduino microelectronics, and they stream the data over to the cloud, and they actually publish the step-by-step way to actually do this. So all of a sudden there are hundreds and hundreds of people who are non-technologists who don't even know how to make these sensors before. They start putting together all these sensors, and there are people who are actually mapping this, and there's this beautiful map across Japan of visualizations of the nuclear radiation level, more accurate than what the news tell them. So all of a sudden, all across Japan, people actually turning into this map. They're relying on something that has been created by the public themselves, because there is that driver, again, for the greater good.
And just briefly, I mean, there's an issue there as well, isn't there, about cost? The fact that you can actually do that kind of collaboration, you can actually collect that kind of data using technology that most of us already have in our pockets. We're not talking about rolling out technology, expensive technology to do this.
Yeah, there's so much, low cost off-the-shelf technology right now. Like, as I said, if you have smartphones here, there are at least 50 sensors in your smartphones, if you don't believe it. In today's smartphones, and if you actually let people, all these futures context sensor researchers like me, for example, allow me to actually tap into your smartphone sensors, and we can actually start learning about activities. And how we actually turn it for your good, for your greater good, of course, or for the community good, there can be a lot of different open-ended opportunities.
Nikos Papastiadis, if we're talking about convergence and we're talking about getting people to collaborate, to engage in the way that we've just talked about, we also have to change our mindset, don't we? We have to start thinking about things not as being complete, but as being incomplete, if you like. We have to accept the fact that whatever conclusions we come to, or whenever we finish a project, somebody else might come along and want to build on top of that and accept that could be a good thing. Is that correct?
That's very correct. In fact, the famous semiotician Umberto Eco, the author of the Name of the Rose, that's it. He wrote a beautiful essay in the 1950s called The Open Work, where he predicted as early as then that no art would ever be complete, no text would ever be finished, that everything will remain in this state of glorious incompletion, and that everybody will participate and collaborate. And in fact, Joseph Beuys, the artist, always talked about that principle as motivating contemporary art, that it's never finished in and of itself until the audience steps in, until the other person participates in its completion, maybe purely in terms of its contemplation, in its production in one's mind, but it might also involve some further steps and additions and gestures and material contribution from people from outside the audience who become co-producers. So this idea of co-production has now gone viral, of course. Sampling, blogging, all these media formats have enabled cultural contributions to expand and proliferate at vaster levels. But for as much as we may celebrate this participatory logic, we still have to come back to these fundamental ideas about defining what values are and accepting that the role of selecting is a very complex process. Defining what values are, like Flora says, people will be motivated if they feel that they are contributing to a collective good. But if we are living in a political climate where the transfer of the public good is always being turned into private commodities, and then there's more reticence to do that until they see more material return for themselves. So there is an ideological battle to be fought there as well. There is a sort of cultural battle to be fought about what is the public good, how do we define these things. And to come back to the beautiful examples about the medical carers and the knowledge that they contain and that they have acquired, it's because the patient often is exactly that, a patient. They have to quietly, calmly be the receiver of medical interventions, and it's the carer who observes and coordinates and has to select and balance up all the information that is thrust upon the patient. And these days, and again, like you, I might become not a friend of the medical industry now, so many of the medical practitioners will say, you have 4 options. And until you say to that medical practitioner, but which one would you do if it was your wife, you don't know how to rank those 4 options. How does a stranger who comes into this topic for the first time select from these so-called 4 options? So these are complex challenges that we're confronted all the time. And we have to sort of find new levels of expertise in our daily lives.
George, picking up on what Nikos said right there at the beginning about the political changes within our society, that we are becoming more commercial, there is much more corporatisation. Do you worry that we're giving away in that a sense of the common good, if you like, and that in turn will affect our ability to be more convergent and to be more collaborative?
Yes, very much so. I mean, we live in a world in which socio-economic fragmentation is increasing year on year within countries and across countries. And I think I have several fears, and that's about those who will remain excluded from any of these developments as this fragmentation increases. Other fears I have go back to how this type of media convergence is used in the type of world that Aldous Huxley described in Brave New World, where it just becomes a sort of soma for the people, where we use the convergent technologies to keep the people sort of amused with things like Survivor, which I noticed our mentor Harry Jenkins referred to at the beginning. So, with this, fragmentation, where you get young people now who see little chance of work, or if they do see chances of work, it's insecure, it's short term, it's casual work. I have concerns about the types of youngsters, teenagers we see now who are convergent, but convergent on a global scale, where they're converging around games which they play in their bedrooms. They emerge occasionally to refuel with a bit of water and a bit of food. And so they are totally connected to people on the other side of the world, but have no connection whatsoever with the society they live in. And I have fears about that type of thing if we're talking about the convergent city for Melbourne, that there may be so many people who are converged with Los Angeles, Munich, Berlin, and disconnected from Hawthorne and Richmond.
Bronwyn Clune, there is a renegotiation that goes on, isn't there, between what we mean by local and what we mean by global now, because of the fact that we can be in our bedroom and be acting in a very global way, in a way that was just not possible in previous generations without the sort of technology we have. Do we need to renegotiate or re-understand at least what is meant by locality?
Look, I think we're still, learning how this will play out. We've certainly not had a generation come through that in places of power and decision making that have grown up with that. I think it's something that we're going to kind of see evolve in the next 10 to 15 years.
Watch this space.
Yeah, pretty much watch this space. I think access to a larger network of people is not necessarily a bad thing, but we're still understanding how that impacts us in our day-to-day lives. I don't think that's clear yet, and there are risks to losing touch with things that are around us. But I think the benefit, if we're smart about it, is going to outweigh the risk.
Now, we're fast running out of time. I do want to end this part of the discussion, at least, on a positive note. So I'd like to talk about the sorts of things that could foster greater levels of convergence. Claire Scott, if I could start with you. And you mentioned earlier about Wi-Fi. Free Wi-Fi, you think. More places that have free Wi-Fi within a city, that could be a way of getting people to start thinking about this and start to collaborate.
Well, I think it's a very positive thing when you're having a discussion, and if you want to look something up, you can. And I mean, I don't know about you, but that happens to me every day, and I'm used to having the answer on the end of my smartphone. And it's all very well if you have access to the web, but if for some reason you don't, really to facilitate that access would be a positive thing. And you would think that most of the people who are benefiting from that are the people who need it. They don't have free access, and it provides free access to knowledge. So perhaps even starting to work out how many people who are in the CBD at any one time in Melbourne don't actually have access to the internet at the tip of their fingers. I mean, I think that would be a good starting point. And I do see it as access to knowledge. So that allows you to, get to maybe a first point in a discussion, picking up on information that's not there. It's not necessarily just a question of access to Wi-Fi. Of course, you want secure access. So it may not be that it is citywide, but you may have, real hubs where you have quite well-controlled Wi-Fi access and people know where to go, and it's not always a coffee shop.
So you don't have to fork out the cost of a coffee to engage. Bronwyn, sorting out then or giving priority to understanding who is excluded from the connectivity that we have as much as who is included, that's then crucial, isn't it?
Yeah, and it's a hard one to figure out who isn't being listened to, because how do you almost find them? That is an issue, and I think something we have to bear in mind when we talk about the ability now for everyone to share the information and the fact that they do have a voice is who's being excluded from those conversations, and then how do we go about finding them? And I'm not sure I have the answer to that, but I certainly think it's something we need to explore.
So technology is one thing, connectivity is obviously a part of that. Nikos, what about the way in which our cities or our environments, our built environments are structured? What about the physical spaces that we need?
Well, that's a very good question about the open and closed spaces of the cities. And to what extent is there a common space? And to what extent is there a place for convergence, in other words? I think public spaces have become very much contested spaces, and we've got a fantastic example of Federation Square, which has been a success beyond all our dreams, because I'm old enough to remember the old city square where not even the pigeons wanted to go to. And so we now have a place where people go to for all sorts of reasons, and they even go there when they know they could see the real thing just across the road, but they choose to go to the virtual space where they can be and conduct themselves in interesting ways. So that's a phenomenally interesting example how Federation Square has transformed the idea of the urban environment. But I think over and above that, what we need is two other things. And I was just thinking this in response to the question you asked to Bronwyn and to Claire. And that is everyone needs to learn at least one more language in order to be convergent. We must learn to know what it means to think in a language other than the one you were born into and become educated. And I also think we all should do a crash course in cosmology, because, the physicist Stephen Hawking said philosophy's dead. Now, of course, he was being facetious and cheeky, as he always is, but he was also making a big point. In other words, the humanities and the social sciences and all the disciplines, in some sense, have become so specialised that they're looking at the very narrow tip of the problem. And we've lost the capacity to think of the very biggest question possible. How did life begin?
Flora, language, your thoughts on that? I mean, in a country like Australia, as Nikos has said, do we need to invest more time, have much more of a focus on languages in order to make the most of the world that we're already in it, we're entering, but to make the most of a world that will become much more convergent over time?
Well, I'm actually quite fortunate to be born with two mother tongues apart from English. So English is actually my third language. And it actually forces me to think in a multifaceted ways. And I think that is a very good point. And for me, one thing that also helps me to think in a converging way, because I'm not against specialization. You have to be an expert of something, but you also need to be able to communicate and pitch your ideas so that you can then converge and actually collaborate with people. So, and the way I've been forced into that is when I started joining RMIT after I was working in Monash in a very specialized lab, is actually when I was working under Mark Barry in a Design Research Institute. And design research is really one way to really force you to think in a very converging way, which is design. Like everything has to be designed. And in order for you to have designing in a very good way, of course, then you have to actually start talking to these right people. And it goes, even with your closing note of that, designing the first human life. I mean, again, it's a very complex problem. Everything's a complex problem, but then design, you start through design. You start everything through design. And by doing that, then you actually foster collaboration. And one way of, just touching a little bit on language as well is, I'm also very interested in researching collaborative interfaces. So how do you actually design interface that you can even put in a public space, for example, that actually foster collaboration? You just engage people to collaborate, and no matter what language they are, no matter what kind of ontology or specific languages in their disciplines, but they're just forced to collaborate. I mean, it's not forced, but they are engaged to collaborate through that kind of interfaces.
Flora, we might have a look at that DVD now.
Video, yep. So, this is taking an example of architecture and construction project, which is a very complex problem, but one complex issue is wind simulation. Understanding impact of new constructions on a site, especially on wind conditions on pedestrian level, is very complex to simulate. And we usually need expertise in wind engineers. And the issue of, for example, wind that caused the collapse of a wall in Grocott site, for example. So wind can cause that kind of problem. And in here, what we're trying to do is we actually pull in real-time wind simulation that is not, as accurate as high definition computational fluid dynamics, but it's actually good to get people, even non-experts, to get around the table and actually exercise different design options, and actually they could actually see, for example, what happened if we take that building 80, the new building 80, we take it out of Swanson Street, where will the front of the wing goes for? So. And we're actually right now doing an experiment with the table, for example, looking at different building options for the Grocon site, which is behind Design Hub, and we'd like to see how that actually will. So in here, I'm actually saying I mentioned that this is one example of collaborative interface, and why I call this as collaborative interface because actually in this project we had professor of construction management involved. We had professor in architecture, we had a professor in business involved, and also professor in ethnography involved. And we could actually get people coming from these different disciplines to talk about a specific problem by giving them handles to a specific problem. And the way we did this is giving that building models as a way to interact and in a very playful experience. And also making it very intuitive. And I think also, if you actually have to, the current practice of architecture and construction is the architect design it, they are on this screen, and then they pass it on to different disciplines. So they're no longer congregating, they're no longer communicating in a very efficient way. But so for me, the notion of table, where you actually can converge around the table, and pulling real-time data, pulling simulation, pulling all these kind of analytics around the table and visualize it and get people talking around that collaborative interface. That's what I call as one example of convergence.
Well, look, thank you very much for that, Flora. And questions?
We're talking about convergence and the idea of being bombarded with information and trying to have a specialist who can help us through all of that information. And I think one of the panellists talked about how you go to the doctor and you get a different set of views. But it's interesting when you think about some of the traditional roles. The general practitioner has general in that title, yet I think at the moment that role seems to be diverging from convergence, if you like. It's almost as though you're in, you're out, and you're a product. And it's part of the process, and I'm not quite sure how that's come about. I wonder if perhaps there's some sort of lesson we've got there that we need to learn. And the other sort of specialist I'm wondering about is the librarian. As someone who's trained to actually understand information, understand the authenticity, and to help us in that way. I have just a few thoughts in that regard. Perhaps you could respond.
Claire, perhaps you could start.
A quick medical response. So I think the value of a good GP is enormous in acting as that triage person. So you're right that they're a generalist and they have to be able to spot which direction is the best path for this patient, particularly as Nikos described, because otherwise if they get to the surgeon first, they're going to get it chopped out. If they get to the oncologist first, they're going to get chemo. And really, you actually need someone who can stand back and say, this is the best path for your investigation, or we should do things in this order. And I don't think we get around, we will not move away from that. But what we can do to help that GP is have better structures and better feedbacks. And so right at the moment, that big hole at the end of Elizabeth Street, which is going to be the new Victorian Comprehensive Cancer Centre, the types of virtual preparation that we're doing for bringing that big hub together is really trying to improve our communication back to the community and particularly back to the GP. And all of that should be online and instant. And the GP should be able to see, tonight what happened to you this morning. And there's no reason why that shouldn't happen. It's just a bit of an IT issue. So I'm not promising it tomorrow or next week, and Jim Bishop would, be furious with me if I promised it any time soon. But that is the challenge for us. And that should go some ways to fixing that problem.
Just a quick comment that we do have free Wi-Fi hotspots around the city, and they're called libraries.
Yeah.
That's a very good.
That's
that is
true.
A very good point.
And the steps outside of the State Library have been a fascinating case study for one of the projects I'm involved in, because what we found is that people will go to those steps and do all sorts of work, from doing Skype with their friends in Ireland, checking out whether to purchase tickets for an event here in Melbourne, downloading information, sharing a laptop with a friend to watch a movie together. So on a sunny day outside of the steps of the State Library, you see an incredibly interesting congregation of people with their laptops. Now, you can have another free Wi-Fi spot in a less hospitable space, may also be a library, but just somehow might not have grass, might not have steps, might not have shade. And guess what? No one goes there. So the ecology that makes an environment work isn't just technology. No. Maybe just shade as well.
And are, a question for anybody on the panel, are enough local authorities thinking about that? I mean, we know that there are councils out there who are looking at this issue. Are enough of them thinking about exactly how you do it, not just doing it?
Well, I hope so, but this goes back to the point that Salim was making as well. Sorry, Flora that was making, Flora Salim, which is the capacity to get lots of people around the table to input with different kinds of perspectives. So the ethnographic perspective might tell you how people from actual users experiencing that space. The technology person might tell you what the bandwidth might be, etc. The architecture person might sort of help you configure hospitality zones, etc. So unless you have those expertises working collaboratively, simultaneously in real time, it's unlikely you'll fluke it. Now, maybe the State Library designed it, maybe they fluked it as opposed to other places, which I won't mention. But which do have free Wi-Fi and have not even pigeons, as I say.
George.
Yeah, I think beyond talking about the space and the technology, it's also about mindsets. I was talking with a colleague recently who told me about a combination of technology, space, mindset, which seemed to be to exemplify where the best of convergence lies. I was talking about the very earliest stages of primary education in a school where the students, I think, I'm not used to the Australian things, but I think it was sort of years 2 or 3 or something, all had iPads, and it was all based on problem-based learning. Here is an issue, here's a problem, go in and learn about it. It seems to me that as we go through education, we still reach a stage where this idea of working with problems and exploration, etc., is beaten out of people, and they get more into the go and learn the answers so that you can regurgitate them. And I think we need to move towards a revolution in education right through to tertiary, to universities, to say people need to develop skills, not in knowing about a discipline, but in understanding how to construct problems and how to work in teams to address these problems.
I'm a design anthropologist, and I'm really interested in what you're just saying now around people needing to gain these skills in fostering collaboration and engagement between disciplines. And as a design anthropologist and just graduating, I'm actually finding it really difficult to find work in an area doing precisely that as a discipline. And I'm just wondering what your thoughts are on that as a discipline and if there is actually room for that.
To me, it sounds like a specialised discipline, whereas in fact I know another design anthropologist that I was working with last week who is, sort of working with collaborative, multidisciplinary, problem-based things. And I think probably it's a discipline which is not understood in society, in organisations, businesses. You may have to market yourself slightly differently, I think.
I've often witnessed experts make very big decisions or pronounce big judgments about public spaces on the basis of their personal prejudices, whims, fancies, etc. And every now and then I've had the opportunity to say, on what data, what evidence, what information, what process of observation have you come to that conclusion? And often they'll just say, oh, it's obvious, isn't it? That's where you come in and say, excuse me, let's question, test, explore what you think is obvious, and compare and contrast that with the actual user's experiences, impressions, and memories or expectations of other people. How will we get that? Observe, interview, hang out. Be part of the life world of the people. So you're not only seeing what was obvious to one expert, but what is actually emergent and potentially possible from a whole range of new people and new users and new demographies. I mean, look at the city as it lives today. I think on a Thursday night, there's few cities in the world which are as cosmopolitan as Melbourne. I'm not sure about Saturday night, but Thursday night it's a bliss.
An old book, I think, Beyond the Stable State, gave the example of Canadian log wrestling, where the log was turning, it was floating downstream, and you were fighting the guy opposite you, as an example of complexity. I was just wondering whether your school's teaching complexity, and do you think we'll move beyond a stable state where there won't be a finality of things and you will be just continually moving from job to job and doing things as they come up?
Ooh, wow. That's a sort of question about the world and the universe and all that it contains. I don't think the school that I'm talking about was teaching complexity. I think it was only enabling children to learn in a fairly natural way, which I think is where modern technologies do have the capability of allowing us to learn in ways which we do as children. When children are, babies, you just watch them learning with their environment, with the things they find in the environment. And of course, parents can put certain things in the environment to help the children learn. And I think it's that type of learning that we need to develop more. And I'm afraid I'm very much against the nanny state. I think that we have lost the ability to let people learn from mistakes, and we've become too bound up in telling children that climbing on something which is higher than that is very dangerous and shouldn't be allowed, and through to telling people they shouldn't do this, shouldn't do that, such that they never learn what danger is until they really are in trouble.
And we take away their ability to experiment, I suppose.
Yes, yeah. And they're too bound up in not allowing people to explore boundaries and go beyond boundaries.
Oh, hi. Just in the spirit of knowledge sharing, for the person who had the question about how to apply their design anthropology skills in the commercial context, I work as a user experience professional and also work with a design anthropologist. And so if you maybe attend some of the service design meetups, if you go to like meetup.com and start looking around, that's a good way to network and find your way into an industry where you'll be valued. Just for the panel, as long as I got the mic, there was a point that was touched on earlier that there was no definitive answer to, but it was in regards to digital outcasts, so that segment of society who are suffering from disability or poverty, or they just choose not to participate in the digital life. And I think that on the cusp of becoming a convergent society, it is important for us to identify that these people shouldn't be left behind. And if there were any challenges that people wanted to take up through collaboration, it should be, that would be a good one to start with. How to make sure that the digital outcasts don't get left behind. So if anybody's got any ideas on how to fix that.
And just adding to that, are things going to change if we become more connected? I mean, there's the NBN, however that ends up being rolled out fully.
Everyone's looking at me.
Anybody else on the panel? Bronwyn?
But I do want to say something about the digital outcasts. Maybe they're there as a conscious decision. There's this constant misconception of what boredom is with kids. You think that kids who are bored are disconnected, not engaged, all those sorts of negative things. But boredom may be a refusal to be engaged in the very activities that the parents want them to be engaged in. And so I also consider it a sign of my avant-garde civilizational qualities that I refuse to use my mobile phone on a tram or eat chips in public.
With Bronwyn, people who aren't taking part in the digital world in a sense, I mean, there's digital outcasts, that idea, but we also sometimes pigeonhole people, don't we? We do it sometimes with age. We assume everyone who's in their teens and 20s is really into digital technology, and that at the other end of the scale, not necessarily so. But that's not always the case, is it?
No, I don't think so. Certainly in my experience with my teenage children that it is true, though. Yeah, I mean, the digital outcast is a really important issue and one we can't kind of overlook. And I think you're right, it is a great opportunity for collaboration about how we think about that issue. And I think things like NBN Co, which someone mentioned, I don't think that's going to solve that problem. It's just going to, probably increase the usage of those of us who are already using it. It's certainly not going to solve the problems for anyone who's being left behind. I don't know what the answer is to that, but I think it's an important one.
Flora?
I actually have one PhD student who's actually working with the indigenous communities, actually on spatial temporal storytelling. So actually giving handles to these communities to tell their story through mixed reality installations and apps. So they are digital outcasts, and they most of them are, they don't really perhaps use all these different kind of mixed augmented reality apps or all this kind of thing. But we actually show them the value of doing this. That some of the sites, indigenous sites, are overlooked by the government, and there's so much and rich stories in it that they are never told. And there's this new way of telling the story by actually overlaying all these physical sites with digital data and visualizing it in a way that is actually very engaging and also moving. So and they see the value in that. So again, what is the driver? What's the value? And we see them actually engaging with this PhD student of mine, and I see that's very interesting.
Can I just make a final point about, the flip side of the digital outcast is also that sometimes we take it for granted how far the penetration of digital is, though. I'm still fascinated by the fact on the We Melbourne account that I mentioned, I think they've had 2 homeless people tweet from an account, which it's not something you'd think they'd have access to, but obviously they do. And another account which has given a great voice to in the Indigenous culture is a Twitter account called Indigenous X, which The Guardian highlights every week in a column, talking and interviewing those people. So, as much as we say there are people being left behind, there's also really great examples of people who are being brought into the fold, and often people you wouldn't assume are actually experiencing digital in the way that we are.
Can I just make one comment about that? I think it's taken maybe the last 10 years for most of us to really change our practice with a mobile phone, and 10 years is nothing. So people who maybe thought they were too old to do it, well, dum-de-dum, 10 years later, it's still here. And I think many elderly people are taking it up and thriving on it and realising that, okay, they can say they don't want to learn now, but maybe in 6 months or a year, it's actually going to be even easier. So the usability of all of these devices, and also the fact that they multitask. So my understanding is that for women, it was the device that had the fastest uptake in terms of technology, and I think personally that's because it does about 100 things for me every day. So I can't actually manage to lose it because I keep needing it for something else. So, I think there's all these reasons why, from a practical perspective, it's going to become more embedded, not less.
And it's push-pull as well, isn't it? It becomes more difficult, or it is becoming more difficult. It is becoming difficult to operate without having at least some digital skills or access to digital technology. Even things like getting a decent price for insurance, say.
I love the fact that my grand's 97 and on Facebook. I'm sure a lot of people have similar stories. But I remember showing her Skype one day, and I thought it would be the most amazing thing she'd ever seen, and she was completely non-fussed by it. And I said, Gran, you're talking to someone on video on the other side of the world, and it's for free. And she said, Bronwyn, I saw man land on the moon. It's not really that big a deal. And that really put the whole perspective of these advances, put it into perspective for me. So.
Well, look, we've run out of time, so unfortunately that's where we're going to have to leave it today. Thanks to all of our panellists, Professor George Cairns, the head of the School of Management at RMIT University, Bronwyn Clune, a journalist, writer and digital news consultant, Professor Nikos Parpastiadis from the School of Culture and Communications at the University of Melbourne, Dr. Flora Salim, who specialises in computer science and information technology at RMIT University, and finally Associate Professor Claire Scott from the Walter and Eliza Hall Institute of Medical Research. And let's give them all a round of applause.